Hey guys! Tonight, we're heading back to one of the oldest paper trails in human history. Except it's not paper. It's clay. Heavy, lumpy, sun-dried clay. The kind that doesn't fold neatly, doesn't stack well, and absolutely doesn't fit into your pocket. So dim the lights, settle in, and imagine a world where record-keeping meant lugging around half a brick every time you wanted to make a shopping list. Welcome to Mesopotamia, land between the rivers, birthplace of cities, and apparently, birthplace of bureaucracy. Picture it, southern Iraq, around 5,000 years ago. Cities like Uruk and Babylon rise out of the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates. Farmers are growing barley, herding goats, and grumbling about irrigation canals. Priests run temples like giant corporations. Kings are strutting around in fancy robes, claiming they've been handpicked by the gods. And somewhere in the background, a scribe is squatting over a damp lump of clay, pressing wedge-shaped marks into it with a reed stylus. This, my friends, is the origin of writing. Not to compose poetry, not to share profound wisdom, not even to doodle. No, the first thing humans decided was worth writing down was grain. Bushels of barley owed to the temple. Goats counted in the pen. Jars of beer handed out to workers. Humanity's first great invention of literacy was basically receipts, which is somehow both disappointing and completely on brand. The tablets themselves are humble little things. Palm-sized, hand-sized, sometimes bigger. Made of river clay rolled into neat patties. While still damp, a reed stylus was pressed into them to form wedge marks, what we now call cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. Dry the tablet in the sun, or bake it in a kiln if you wanted something permanent, and there you go. A record that could last for millennia. Which is why we're still finding them, stacked in the ruins of ancient cities like forgotten filing cabinets. And make no mistake, there are a lot of them. Tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Whole libraries of clay tablets. Imagine walking into a temple archive and seeing shelves full of little bricks, each one recording something like, 3 goats delivered. 1 goat suspiciously missing. Investigation pending. It's a miracle of preservation, and also proof that bureaucracy has been annoying people for 5,000 years. Now, let's talk about the scribes. These were the human typewriters of Mesopotamia, and they were everywhere. Becoming a scribe wasn't a hobby. It was a lifetime commitment. Young boys, usually from elite families, were sent to tablet schools, where they spent endless hours practicing signs. Day after day, they pressed wedges into clay, copying lists of words, names of animals, and multiplication tables. Imagine being a 10-year-old and having to memorize every possible way to write sheep. And it wasn't easy. Cuneiform wasn't just one alphabet. It was hundreds of signs, some representing sounds, some representing whole words, and some just existing to make life more complicated. Scribes memorized thousands of these, drilling until they could write swiftly and without mistakes. Their training texts survive, full of clumsy signs where some poor student clearly had a bad day. You can almost hear the teacher scolding him, "No, not that wedge, the other wedge. Start over." But once you graduated, being a scribe was a ticket to power. You could work for a temple, tallying offerings and loans. You could serve in a palace, recording laws and treaties. You could even write private letters for merchants who wanted to send messages across the city or to distant lands. In a world where most people were illiterate, the ability to scratch wedges into clay was like holding the keys to the kingdom. Of course, literacy also had its quirks. For example, letters. People sent messages on clay tablets, sealed them in clay envelopes, and stamped them with their cylinder seals. Little carved stones rolled across the surface to leave unique signatures. Imagine mailing a brick with your carved emoji stamped on the front. The recipient had to crack it open to read the text inside. Efficient? Not really.
Durable?
Absolutely. There are Mesopotamian letters still intact, where you can practically read someone's ancient complaint about late deliveries. And the content of these tablets? Well, let's just say they cover the full range of human priorities. Yes, there are grand epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh, philosophical texts, hymns to the gods. But most tablets are gloriously mundane. Records of rations handed out to workers, X liters of beer, why loaves of bread? Contracts, I lend you 2 oxen, return them after harvest. Marriage agreements, if she leaves him, she takes the dowry. If he leaves her, he pays compensation. It's the humdrum of daily life, fossilized in clay. And that's what makes them so strangely soothing. Reading these ancient ledgers, you realize that people have always been people. Complaining, counting, borrowing, promising, tallying, squabbling over goats. 5,000 years may have passed, but the basic rhythms of human paperwork haven't changed. So tonight, imagine sitting in the scribal school of Uruk. The room smells of damp clay. Students sit cross-legged, each with a little tablet in their lap, stylus in hand. They practice the same sign over and over, their hands aching, their tablets filling with wedge marks. A teacher paces behind them, muttering corrections. Outside, the temple looms, its walls hung with offerings. Farmers shuffle in, bringing jars of barley to pay their dues. And at the end of the day, the scribes record it all, 40 jars of barley received. 2 goats delivered. 1 goat still missing. The world turns. The clay hardens. And thousands of years later, archaeologists dig it up, shake off the dust, and squint at the wedges. A lost voice speaks again. So, we've got our scribes. Trained from childhood, armed with styluses, and destined to spend their lives hunched over damp clay, making tiny wedges until their fingers cramped. But what did their day-to-day life actually look like? Let's peek into the office of a Mesopotamian scribe. Spoiler, it looks like your office, minus the coffee and plus a lot of dust. Imagine a scribal clerk in the city of Ur, sometime around 2000 BCE. He wakes up, probably in a small house made of mud brick. Breakfast is bread and beer, the Mesopotamian equivalent of a bagel and coffee. Then he heads off to the temple complex, where he works. His desk is basically a bench or the floor, with baskets of wet clay ready for writing. His tools? A stylus carved from reed, maybe a few of different sizes for different wedges. That's it. No quills, no parchment, no scrolling through emails. Just clay, reeds, and sore hands. His job? Endless lists. He tallies grain deliveries, notes down wages, drafts contracts. Farmers line up to declare their goods. Priests dictate rituals that need recording. Merchants pay scribes to write business deals. And our poor scribe dutifully scratches it all into clay. By midday, he probably has a small mountain of tablets drying in the sun beside him, each one recording something thrilling like 2 jars of sesame oil received, 3 donkeys hired for transport. Riveting stuff. The archives of these scribes were astonishing. Whole temple storerooms were crammed with clay tablets, shelves stacked high, baskets overflowing, piles in corners. Think of it as the world's first data storage center, except instead of hard drives, it was bricks. Archaeologists have found entire libraries preserved in ancient ruins, thousands of tablets covering every aspect of life. One of the most famous is the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, from the 7th century BCE. This Assyrian king had a serious collector's streak. He ordered scribes to copy texts from across Mesopotamia, filling his palace with a massive clay archive. Myths, hymns, medical texts, astronomical charts, you name it. Thanks to him, we even have the Epic of Gilgamesh preserved. Imagine being so into your personal book collection that you build an archive big enough to survive for millennia. That's dedication. But not all libraries were royal. Temples had their archives. Cities had administrative centers filled with tablets. Even private houses sometimes stored letters and contracts. Picture a merchant's home with a basket of tablets in the corner. Letters from business partners, IOUs, receipts. Basically the ancient version of a junk drawer stuffed with old bills. And oh, the letters. These are some of the most delightful finds because they feel so human. A letter might read, "Why haven't you sent the copper as promised? Don't make me come down there." Or, "I hear you've been cheating me in the grain trade. This is unacceptable." One even says, "More or less. Send more beer. Immediately." These were written on clay, wrapped in a thin clay envelope, and sealed with a cylinder seal. Little carved stones rolled across the surface to leave a unique signature. You couldn't steam these envelopes open like a sneaky spy. You had to crack them with a knife or stone, destroying the seal. Privacy, Mesopotamian style. And then there are the little quirks that sneak through. Scribal students sometimes doodled on tablets, drawing crude sketches of humans, animals, or even caricatures of teachers. Some tablets have practice lines scratched faintly into the clay, like notebook margins filled with half-hearted doodles. Others show mistakes crossed out, or notes where the scribe clearly got bored. You can almost hear the ancient sighs. Even the spelling mistakes are comforting. Thousands of years later, we're still laughing at typos. Somewhere in Uruk, a scribe once swapped wedges and turned goat into something nonsensical. The teacher probably shook his head, muttering, "Kids these days." The archives also held legal contracts, and these are where Mesopotamian daily life really shines through. Marriage contracts, for instance, spell out the terms of relationships in delightful detail. A typical contract might say, if he divorces her, he pays compensation. If she leaves him, she forfeits the dowry. If they both get fed up, the court decides. Romantic, isn't it? Nothing says eternal love like a clay tablet listing the penalties for running away. Then there were loan contracts. Need a donkey? Borrow one. Pay interest. Return it by harvest. Need seed grain? Here's the rate. Everything written down, sealed, witnessed. Bureaucracy wrapped its clay arms around every transaction. And, of course, work rations. Workers on large building projects were paid not in coins but in food, beer, bread, oil. Tablets record these meticulously. Each worker receives 2 liters of beer, 1 loaf of bread. Day after day, ration lists filled archives. If you've ever had to submit timesheets for payroll, you and a Mesopotamian worker share the same ancient pain. It's easy to think of these tablets as dry, lifeless records. But when you read enough of them, voices emerge. The worker complaining that his rations are short. The merchant haggling over copper shipments. The anxious father arranging a marriage for his daughter. The ambitious king boasting of his victories. All pressed into clay, frozen for eternity. So tonight, picture walking into one of these archives. It's a dim mud brick room. The air is cool and smells faintly of earth. Along the walls, shelves sag under the weight of clay tablets. Baskets overflow with receipts and contracts. A scribe sits in the corner, scratching away with his reed. Outside, the world hums with markets and temples. Inside, every detail of that world is being captured, in wedges, on clay, waiting quietly for the next 5,000 years. The scribes may be long gone. The cities have crumbled, but their ledgers are still here. And in their monotony, they whisper the texture of a life that feels strangely familiar. So far, we've looked at scribes tallying goats and students doodling in clay. But let's zoom out. Mesopotamian tablets weren't just quirky leftovers of daily life. They were the nervous system of entire states. Without them, kings couldn't rule, temples couldn't function, and economies couldn't keep track of who owed what to whom. Basically, the cradle of civilization was also the cradle of paperwork. Start with the temples. In cities like Uruk or Lagash, temples weren't just places to light incense and mumble prayers. They were megacorporations. Each temple owned land, herds, fields, and workers. They collected taxes, loaned grain, and managed construction projects. And to keep all of that organized, clay tablets. Picture the temple of Inanna in Uruk. Farmers arrive with baskets of barley as their temple dues. Herdsmen drive in goats and sheep, counted carefully by priests. Every delivery is recorded. A scribe sits by the gate with his clay, scratching, 10 jars barley received. 6 goats received. 2 goats missing. It's always goats. The Mesopotamian tax system seems to have had a goat problem. The temple storerooms are full of grain, oil, and beer, all tallied on tablets stacked neatly in baskets. These weren't just random notes. They were contracts, receipts, obligations. If a farmer later claimed, "I paid my barley," the priest could pull out the tablet and say, "Well, actually, no you didn't." Bureaucratic pettiness was alive and well 5,000 years ago. Then there were the kings. From the earliest city-states to the mighty empires of Babylon and Assyria, rulers depended on scribes to project their authority. Laws, decrees, treaties, all pressed into clay. Want to boast about your conquests? Commission scribes to carve royal inscriptions. Want to make sure your subjects pay their taxes? Archive every payment in neat little rows of wedges. One of the most famous examples is the Code of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE. Everyone's heard the eye for an eye bit, but what it really was. A giant legal FAQ, written in cuneiform on a stone stele and countless tablets. It detailed everything from inheritance rules to penalties for botched surgeries. Hammurabi's genius wasn't inventing justice, it was branding himself as the king who wrote it all down. Here's my law. It's in clay. Good luck arguing with that. Royal correspondence also thrived on clay. Take the Amarna letters from Egypt in the 14th century BCE. Hundreds of clay tablets found in Pharaoh Akhenaten's city, written in Akkadian cuneiform. These weren't Egyptian documents at all, but international mail from Mesopotamian kings, Canaanite princes, and other Near Eastern rulers. Kings calling each other brother, trading daughters in marriage, demanding gold, whining about late shipments. International diplomacy conducted by mailing bricks. Practical? No. Durable? Very. Then there were the empires of Assyria. These guys loved record-keeping almost as much as they loved warfare. Every conquest, every tribute, every deportation, recorded on tablets. Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh wasn't just a vanity project. It was the empire's memory bank. Tablets of medical texts, omens, royal decrees, and yes, endless ration lists. It's like he wanted future archaeologists to think, wow, this guy really liked both astronomy and micromanaging grain deliveries. The beauty, or curse, of clay is that it lasts. Papyrus rots, parchment burns, but clay? Clay bakes hard when buildings collapse in fire. That's why we know so much about palace and temple economies. Archaeologists dig into ruins and find entire rooms full of tablets, many baked solid by ancient destruction. Libraries frozen in time, like someone tipped over the filing cabinet and then set the office on fire. Which, to be fair, is exactly what invading armies often did. And it wasn't just economics and law. Temples used clay to record rituals, hymns, incantations, ceremonies. A priest could pull out a tablet that said, "When Mars rises on the third day of the month, recite this hymn and sacrifice 2 sheep." Super specific. The priests didn't leave much to chance. If you wanted the gods on your side, you followed the checklist exactly. Kings also dabbled in divination through clay. They recorded omens, dreams, and celestial events. If an eclipse happens, the king will face rebellion. Clay tablets preserved these predictions, part astrology, part political anxiety. Imagine running a state where you're terrified of the moon's mood swings. That was Mesopotamian governance. So much of Mesopotamian statecraft was bound up in these lumps of clay. Without them, taxes might be forgotten, treaties disputed, rituals messed up, omens misinterpreted. With them, kings and temples could project power across generations. After all, nothing says legitimacy like a dusty room full of ledgers no one wants to read but everyone has to respect. So tonight, picture a royal archive in Babylon. Mud brick walls, shelves stacked with clay. Scribes shuffle in and out, carrying baskets of tablets. A priest dictates a new hymn, a general files a report on captured prisoners. A farmer brings a tax payment to be recorded. The room hums with the scratch of reeds, the soft squelch of clay, the smell of earth. Outside, the king parades through the city, basking in glory. Inside, the real machinery of power grinds on, quietly, bureaucratically, one wedge at a time. It's not glamorous, but it's what kept the whole system running. Up to now, we've seen clay used as the backbone of temples, kings, and taxes. But Mesopotamian tablets weren't just ledgers. They were also everything else. The archives are littered with odd little texts that remind us people had curiosities, anxieties, and hobbies beyond keeping receipts. Let's start with the school tablets. These are some of the most endearing artifacts we have because they let us peek over the shoulder of ancient students. Imagine a classroom in your around 2000 BCE. A dozen boys sit cross-legged with lumps of clay. On one side, the teacher has scratched a neat model line of cuneiform. On the other, the students attempt to copy it. The results are mixed. Some manage crisp wedges, others smudge or leave half-formed signs. A few tablets still show fingerprints, like the student was fidgeting or trying to hold the clay steady. You can practically hear the muttering, "Not that wedge, no, the other wedge." Teachers sometimes wrote scolding notes too. "Why have you not done your exercise? Do it again." Basically the world's oldest red ink correction. And the texts themselves? Word lists. Long, monotonous word lists. A scribe in training might have to copy out the names of animals, trees, or professions. Sheep, goat, donkey, ox, carpenter, weaver, potter, scribe. Over and over, until the signs stuck. It was dull, but necessary. Literacy in cuneiform wasn't easy, and you didn't get to jump straight into writing poetry. First, you had to suffer through worksheets. Then there are the medical tablets. Mesopotamians had healers, the Asu and the Ipu, roughly doctor and exorcist. Their treatments were written down in long, formulaic recipes. Some were surprisingly practical, ointments made from herbs, poultices for wounds, advice to wash thoroughly. Others were less practical, like chanting an incantation while smearing paste mixed with beer and honey, or wearing an amulet inscribed with the name of a god to chase away demons causing illness. One famous line, "If a man has a fever, boil a turtle shell, mix it with beer, and recite this spell to Shamash." Because nothing says modern medicine like drinking turtle beer while praying. And yet, the tablets show they were systematic. They listed symptoms, diagnoses, and recommended treatments. It's an early attempt to classify disease, to bring order to chaos. Sure, the science was mixed with magic, but the impulse, to observe, to categorize, to try to heal, was the same impulse driving medicine today. Even stranger are the omen tablets. Mesopotamians loved divination. They believed the gods sent messages through everything, the stars, the liver of a sacrificed sheep, the way smoke curled from a fire. So scribes recorded enormous catalogues of omens. If the moon is surrounded by a halo, rain will come. If a sheep has an extra tooth, the king's enemy will fall. If a woman gives birth to a child with 2 heads, famine will strike. Entire libraries of these omens exist, each one a neat line of cause and effect. It's basically the world's earliest superstition database. Priests could consult the tablets like manuals. "Oh, you saw a raven on the left? Bad news. Better postpone your trip." The most elaborate was extispicy, reading sheep livers. Priests would sacrifice an animal, examine its liver, and compare the shape, spots, or marks to lists on tablets. The liver was seen as the seat of life, so its condition reflected the god's mood. Imagine being a royal scribe with shelves of liver charts, flipping through them like an anatomy student before finals. And then there were incantations and rituals. Whole genres of tablets are filled with chants against demons, instructions for purification, or steps for banishing misfortune. Some are practical, like instructions for washing with river water. Others are pure theater. Bind this amulet, recite these 12 lines, burn incense at dawn. One text describes banishing the demon Lamashtu, a feared bringer of infant mortality. The ritual involved carving her image on a tablet, placing it in a shrine, reciting spells, and then burying it. That combination of magic and paperwork sums up Mesopotamian culture neatly. Even supernatural threats needed proper documentation. And of course, the literary tablets. Without them, we wouldn't have the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving epic in the world. Scribes copied it across centuries, preserving the tale of the king of Uruk, his friendship with Enkidu, and his futile quest for immortality. The irony is delicious. Gilgamesh fails to live forever, but thanks to the tablets, his story does. Other texts include hymns to gods, laments for destroyed cities, and even proverbs. Some proverbs are surprisingly sharp. A scribe who knows nothing, what kind of scribe is that? Or, youths, you are stupid. Old men, you are forgetful. Which shows that even 4,000 years ago, People enjoyed complaining about both teenagers and the elderly. Timeless. All these odd tablet genres paint a picture of a society that was meticulous, anxious, curious, and occasionally funny. They wanted order in their lives, whether through ration lists, omen catalogues, or school exercises. They feared disease, sought meaning in the stars, and preserved stories to outlast their empires. And through it all, clay was the medium, heavy, breakable, but eternal once baked. So tonight, picture sitting in a temple library at dusk. The room glows with oil lamps. Scribes shuffle tablets, some covered in endless ration accounts, others filled with spells or star charts. A student mutters as he copies another line of signs. A healer consults a recipe for turtle shell beer. A priest pulls a tablet of omens, trying to reassure the king about tomorrow's eclipse. Outside, the city hums. Inside, the clay holds all its voices, ledgers, hymns, doodles, fears. The whole sweep of Mesopotamian life, pressed into wedges, waiting quietly in the dark. By now we've seen clay tablets manage farms, ration workers, preserve myths, and even double as sheep liver fortune guides. But the story doesn't stop in Mesopotamia. For centuries, cuneiform was the lingua franca of the Near East, the shared written system that let kings and princes send messages across thousands of miles. Yes, before French, before Latin, before English, the global diplomatic language of choice was wedge marks in clay. One of the best windows into this world is the Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt. Picture it, the 14th century BCE, Pharaoh Akhenaten sitting in his peculiar sun-worshipping capital. In his archives, archaeologists found hundreds of clay tablets, not written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in Akkadian cuneiform. Why? Because that was the international standard. These tablets are the world's first diplomatic cables. Letters from Babylon, Assyria, the Hittite Empire, and Canaanite city-states, all addressed to the pharaoh. They start with flowery greetings like, "To my brother, the king of Egypt, thus says the king of Babylon, may the gods grant you health and prosperity." Which sounds polite, until you read a few more and realize they were basically passive-aggressive emails. One Babylonian king complains that Egypt hasn't sent enough gold. Another whines about a delayed princess exchange in marriage negotiations. A Canaanite prince begs desperately for troops, warning that his enemies are at the gates. It's the same tone as corporate inboxes today. Too many requests, not enough resources, and constant blame shifting. The beauty is how mundane some of it is. A tablet might read, "Where are the horses you promised?" Another says, "The shipment of ivory has not arrived. Send it quickly." Some sound like complaints between family members. "You addressed me as your brother, but then treated me like a servant. This is unacceptable." International politics, fueled by wounded pride since forever. And these weren't just for kings. Governors of small Canaanite cities wrote pleading letters too. Dozens of tablets from men like Rib-Hadar of Byblos survive, each one more desperate than the last. "Please, Pharaoh, send soldiers. My enemies are stronger. My city is in danger." He kept writing until finally his pleas stopped, and archaeologists suspect his city fell. Ancient history has its sad email threads too. It wasn't just Egypt. Across the Near East, clay letters flowed between courts. The kings of the Hittites in Anatolia wrote to Babylon. Assyrian rulers corresponded with Elam in Iran. Everyone used Akkadian, the Mesopotamian diplomatic language, even when it wasn't their native tongue. It was like writing in formal French at a medieval court or in English today at international conferences. The wedge script was universal currency. And because clay lasts, these messages survived. We can still read about a Babylonian king negotiating for an Egyptian princess, or a minor Levantine ruler panicking about raids. They feel strangely alive, personal voices pressed into lumps of earth, traveling thousands of miles, waiting quietly in palace archives. The logistics are hilarious to imagine. A courier trudging for weeks with a pouch full of clay bricks. Arriving in a foreign court, presenting the tablet, and the local scribes crowding around to read it aloud. Diplomacy slowed to the pace of donkeys and sandals. But it worked. Empires coordinated alliances, marriages, and wars through these awkward little slabs. Cuneiform also spread into law and trade beyond Mesopotamia. The Hittites, for example, borrowed the script for their own archives, filling them with treaties, contracts, and royal edicts. In Ugarit, a coastal city in modern Syria, scribes adapted cuneiform signs to write a local alphabet. Everywhere the system went, it morphed, but the basic wedges endured. For centuries, the clay tablet was the official paperwork of the ancient world. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you filed your request in wedges. Everyone else might carve in stone, paint on papyrus, or scribble on parchment, but the most formal stuff? Clay. Heavy, ugly, and eternal. And then, slowly, it faded. As alphabets spread and papyrus became more common, cuneiform looked clunky and old-fashioned. By the 1st century CE, it was extinct. No one remembered how to read it. The tablets lay buried for 2,000 years, their voices sealed in silence. Only in the 19th century, when scholars finally cracked the code, did those voices return. Imagine being a Victorian archaeologist, brushing dust off a tablet and realizing you're holding an international letter mailed 3,000 years ago. The ultimate case of "you've got mail." So tonight, picture one of those letters from Amarna. A small, square tablet, its surface covered in neat wedges. On the back, a seal impression. You hold it in your hand, heavier than you expect. Inside the wedges, a king complains about missing gold. A prince begs for soldiers. The pharaoh's scribes set it aside in a basket, where it sat, forgotten, until the palace crumbled. Thousands of years later, archaeologists carry it into the light again. A lost voice. A complaint still waiting for an answer. For thousands of years, the tablets lay buried. Cities collapsed, libraries burned, palaces crumbled into mounds. Clay tablets fell into the rubble, often baked harder by the very fires meant to destroy them. Empires rose and fell, languages died out, and cuneiform faded into silence. By the 1st century CE, no one remembered how to read a single wedge. The tablets were just bricks again. And then, in the 19th century, they began to speak once more. Archaeologists digging in Mesopotamia, mostly Europeans, mostly with big beards and bigger egos, stumbled upon mounds that turned out to be ancient cities. At Nineveh, they uncovered the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace and with it, thousands of tablets from his legendary library. Workers carried baskets of them out by the armload. At first, they looked like rubble. But then scholars noticed the wedge marks. Lines, rows, strange patterns. Not decoration, but writing. The problem? No one could read it. It took decades of patient work, comparing signs, finding bilingual inscriptions, arguing endlessly over wedge shapes. Slowly, scholars cracked the code of cuneiform. And when they did, the voices of Mesopotamia came flooding back. Grain ledgers, marriage contracts, omens, hymns, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, emerging line by line from dust after 2 millennia of silence. Imagine being the first modern person to read Gilgamesh's lament for immortality, written nearly 4,000 years earlier. The weight of it. A king's ancient grief, pressed into clay, finally speaking again. Of course, not every tablet was so poetic. Most were receipts. Which meant the first great archaeological revelation was not just myth and legend, but bureaucracy. You can almost hear the disappointment. Yes, we've rediscovered humanity's oldest epic, but also 37,000 records of sheep rations. Civilization, always glamorous on the outside, always paperwork underneath. But those boring records turned out to be gold. They revealed daily life in astonishing detail. How much beer a worker received, how contracts were written, how marriages were negotiated. They let us see farmers, merchants, scribes, and children, not just kings. Through these ledgers, history became human again. Today, museums hold tens of thousands of these tablets. Rows of shelves in London, Berlin, Baghdad, Istanbul. Many are still unread, waiting for someone with the patience to squint at their wedges. Each one a frozen voice, a conversation paused mid-sentence for 3,000 years. And when you hold one, it feels oddly intimate. The clay is small, heavy, fitting in your palm. You can see fingerprints pressed into the back where a scribe steadied it. You can trace the wedges with your thumb, knowing someone's hand pressed them there in the dim light of a Mesopotamian office. The words may be ancient, but the physicality is immediate. It's like shaking hands across millennia. There's something wonderfully ironic in all this. Kings built monuments, temples, and statues to immortalize themselves. Most of those crumbled, but the grocery lists survived. Bureaucracy outlived glory. The scribes, hunched and anonymous, ended up preserving far more of Mesopotamia than the kings they served. It's a reminder that history isn't only made by rulers. It's made in ledgers, contracts, homework tablets, and letters that begin, "Why haven't you sent the copper as promised?" The quiet, ordinary complaints ended up being the most durable. So tonight, as we close the tablets and set them back on the shelves, picture the scene. A Mesopotamian scribe, 4,000 years ago, pressing his stylus into wet clay. He doesn't know you'll ever read it. He isn't writing for immortality. He's just recording 3 jars of oil received, or a line from a hymn, or a plea to send more beer. Then he sets the tablet aside, wipes his hands, and moves on. The clay hardens. The city falls. Centuries pass. And then, one day, the tablet is in your hand, still whispering its dry, bureaucratic, strangely comforting truth. Civilizations rise. Civilizations fall. But paperwork? Paperwork is forever. But elsewhere, far from battlefields and fortresses, something quieter was unfolding. In the middle of the Persian desert stood a giant mud-brick dome that looked like it ought to be storing grain or guarding some hidden temple. But step inside, and you'd find something astonishing: ice. Blocks and blocks of it. Because tonight, we're talking about how people in ancient Persia managed to keep things cold in blazing summers, with no electricity, no refrigerators, not even a halfway decent icebox. Just geometry, mud brick, and a lot of patience. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's watch some long-dead villagers shovel snow. The Persian plateau is not exactly famous for being chilly. Summers stretch long, dry, and brutally hot. Temperatures soar. Water is precious. And yet, for centuries, Persians not only kept ice through the summer, they stored it in such quantities that nobles could sip sherbet in July. It sounds impossible. It sounds like cheating. But it was just clever engineering. The structures that made this miracle possible are called yakchuls, literally ice pits. From the outside, they look like giant, rounded beehives made of mud brick, sometimes towering 15 meters high. Inside, they hold a deep pit lined with a special waterproof plaster. The thick walls, up to 2 meters thick in places, insulate the interior. A domed roof shades it all, while wind catchers funnel breezes through to keep the air cool. In short, ancient air conditioning. The process started in winter. When temperatures dropped, workers harvested ice from nearby mountains, rivers, or canals. Teams of men hauled it in carts, dragging it across desert roads. Sometimes, they created ice themselves by digging shallow pools next to the actual, letting the water freeze overnight, and then breaking up the ice in the morning. It was slow, repetitive work. Men crouched with chisels, hacking at the frozen sheets, hauling chunks into baskets, and dumping them into the pit. By February, the yakchul would be half full. By March, topped off. Then the dome was sealed, the vents carefully adjusted, and the ice left to sit, slowly melting, yes, but far slower than you'd expect. By summer, nobles in Isfahan or Yazd could stroll into shaded courtyards and enjoy chilled drinks, sweetened syrups, even fruit cooled on blocks of ice. A luxury born from back-breaking winter labor. Daily life around a yakchul had its rhythms. Winter mornings might see lines of men trudging in with ice, their beards frosted, their hands raw. Children darted around, sneaking shards to suck on. Women came later to fetch clean snow for cooking. By evening, the pit was covered again, sealed under mud and straw, cooling silently through the night. In summer, things reversed. Couriers came to collect ice for noble houses. Villagers fetched small amounts for weddings, festivals, or medicine. And, of course, there were sherbets, drinks flavored with rosewater, lemon, or pomegranate, poured over chipped ice. Imagine sitting in a desert courtyard, cicadas buzzing, sun hammering down, and sipping a cup of cold sweetness drawn from a mud brick dome. Not bad for a world without refrigerators. The secret wasn't just thick walls. It was also geometry. The conical dome shape minimized sun exposure, while wind catchers on top funneled hot air upward and cool breezes downward. The underground pit, sometimes more than 6 meters deep, kept the core temperature stable. And the walls were coated with a magical plaster called sarouge, a mix of clay, sand, lime, ash, and goat hair. It was waterproof and nearly impenetrable. Archaeologists still marvel at how effective it was. Honestly, it puts modern sealants to shame. But ice houses weren't only about comfort. They were also about prestige. Only the wealthy had steady access. Kings and governors used ice to impress guests, showing off sherbets at feasts. Poets even wrote about the delights of chilled drinks in the summer heat. It wasn't just refreshment. It was a symbol of power. "Look at me," a noble could say. "I command not just armies, but the very seasons." And yet, ordinary people touched this system too. Weddings might include ice chips for guests. Sick children were sometimes given chilled water to ease fevers. Villagers might be rewarded with a scoop of snow during festivals. The Yakchul was a communal landmark, part storehouse, part miracle. So tonight, picture one standing in the desert twilight. Its mud brick dome glows golden in the fading sun. Inside, a deep silence, broken only by the faint drip of melting ice. Outside, villagers trudge past, wrapped in cloaks against the winter chill, carrying baskets of frozen slabs. In a few months, their labor will melt into sherbets in noble hands. But for now, the Yakchul is simply a quiet, patient dome, swallowing winter whole and keeping it safe until summer. The desert is hot. The air is dry. But beneath the dome, winter waits. So, let's imagine the scene. It's January. The desert nights are brutally cold, the kind of cold that bites through wool cloaks and makes your breath plume like smoke. And out in the fields next to a Yakchul, villagers are at work, ankle deep in shallow pools of water. They are not fishing. They are freezing. The process was simple but punishing. At night, water poured into these shallow channels would freeze into thin sheets. Before dawn, workers came with picks, chiseling up the ice and breaking it into chunks. It had to be done quickly, before the sun rose high enough to undo the night's work. Teams of men and boys shuffled the blocks into baskets, carried them across frosted fields, and dumped them into the waiting Yakchul pit. Then, at night, the process started again. Over and over, until the pit was full. It was tedious, repetitive, and freezing. Fingers numbed, backs ached, and every morning you faced another pool of black water waiting to be frozen into something heavy to haul. No wonder later Persian poets waxed lyrical about the cool luxury of sherbet in summer. Someone had suffered all winter for it. In places closer to mountains, snow was harvested instead. Caravans of mules and donkeys trudged down icy slopes, laden with baskets of packed snow. Each load had to be rushed, before it melted too much in transit. Arriving at the Yakchul, workers dumped the snow into the pit, then tamped it down with straw and layers of ice. Block by block, the pit filled like a freezer being stocked for months to come. Straw played a bigger role than you'd think. Between each layer of ice, workers laid mats of straw or reeds. This slowed melting, absorbed excess water, and made it easier to hack off sections later in the year. Without straw, the whole pit might become one giant, unmanageable iceberg. With it, the ice could be cut and distributed in manageable blocks. It was the difference between order and chaos, and you can almost hear the foreman barking about it. Don't forget the straw, or next summer you'll be chiseling till your arms fall off. The soundscape of these mornings was rhythmic and strangely soothing. Picks clinking against ice. Donkeys braying as they waited for their loads. Men grunting with effort, straw crackling as it was spread. And beneath it all, the muffled thump of blocks landing in the Yakchul pit. Day after day, week after week, until the dome was filled. And the work wasn't just for nobles. Ice was a community resource, even if nobles got first pick. Villagers knew that weddings, festivals, and illnesses might demand it later. Families who helped haul ice often received small shares in summer. Children got to chew on shards as treats. Even if you never sipped sherbet in a palace, you might taste a chip of frozen sweetness on a blazing afternoon, earned from the labor of long winter nights. The logistics of it all were quietly impressive. Supervisors had to manage water channels, coordinate labor teams, ration straw, and schedule deliveries. Too much water in the pools and the ice wouldn't freeze solid. Too little, and the yield was disappointing. One bad season could mean shortages by midsummer. So behind the seemingly simple act of fill the dome with ice was a whole web of planning. Now picture the pit itself being filled. Workers stand at the edge, lowering baskets by rope, dumping ice in layer by layer. Inside, the actual grows colder with every delivery. Condensation gathers on the plaster walls. A faint mist hangs in the air as icy breath mixes with desert dust. When full, the dome becomes a silent vault of winter, sealed against the heat to come. And then life moved on. By March, the labor was done. The pools dried up, the snow stopped coming, and the dome was sealed for months. Villagers returned to farming, planting barley or tending sheep. The ice sat quietly, melting slowly in its insulated tomb, waiting for summer's demand. So tonight, picture standing in that courtyard before dawn. Your hands are raw from lifting blocks. The Yakchal looms above you, its mud brick dome catching the first pale light. Inside, the pit is already half full, glistening faintly with stored frost. Around you, men yawn, donkeys snort, and the last stars fade into morning. It's cold, back-breaking work. But somewhere, months from now, someone will lift a chilled cup of sherbet and sigh with pleasure, never thinking of you, the winter laborer who made it possible. The dome doesn't care. It just holds the ice, silent and patient, while the seasons turn. If you just glance at a Yakchal from a distance, it looks simple. A big mud brick dome, a little surreal against the desert sky. But the magic was in the engineering. These weren't just piles of clay, they were carefully designed machines for manipulating air, water, and time. Let's start with the walls. 2 meters thick, sometimes more, built of sun-dried mud brick, packed with straw and clay, layered until they formed an enormous, sloping cone. The thickness meant insulation. When the desert sun baked the outside, the interior stayed cool. Heat simply couldn't push through that much mud. The walls weren't vertical either, they slanted inward, giving the dome its iconic conical look. This shape minimized surface area exposed to direct sunlight. Less exposure, less heat. Geometry doing the heavy lifting. Inside, the pit went deep. 6, sometimes 8 meters. Dug below ground level, lined with a special plaster called sarouge. Sarouge was a mixture of clay, lime, ash, sand, and chopped goat hair. Yes, goat hair. Because nothing says engineering marvel like goat hair. The result was waterproof, durable, and smooth. Sarouge kept the meltwater from seeping away, and it stopped heat from creeping in. Some Yakchals still survive today, their sarouge lining intact, which is more than I can say for most modern basement waterproofing. Then there were the wind catchers, or badgers. Tall, slender towers attached to the dome, with openings at the top facing into the wind. The principle was simple: hot air rises, cool air sinks. The towers caught breezes, funneled them downward, and pushed warm air up and out. It was a natural air conditioning system, centuries before anyone thought of fans. Step into a Yakchal on a hot day, and you'd feel the cool draft flowing around you, engineered by nothing more than mud brick and physics. Water management was another quiet marvel. Many Yakchals were connected to kanats, underground water channels that brought cool water from distant mountains. Kanats were an invention as revolutionary as any empire. Dig a sloping tunnel, line it with stone, and water would flow gently downhill for miles, shielded from the sun. In summer, this kept pools near Yakchals cool enough to produce ice at night. In winter, it made filling the pits easier. Without kanats, the system wouldn't have worked. And then there's the roof. The dome wasn't just decorative, it was functional. Its steep slope let hot air rise inside, while minimizing heat absorbed during the day. At night, the dome radiated heat outward, cooling itself like a giant earthen radiator. Holes could be opened or closed to control airflow. Builders didn't just slap mud together, they calculated angles, tested airflow, and perfected designs over generations. Standing inside one of these domes must have felt almost sacred. Dim light filtering down. Thick walls enclosing silence. A faint draft from the windcatcher, whispering past. The pit below, filled with layers of ice and straw. The temperature dropping as you descended. It wasn't a palace, but it had the stillness of one. A space carved out of desert heat, dedicated to preserving something fleeting, cold. And here's the thing, none of this was written in technical manuals. The knowledge was passed down through craft, from builder to apprentice, father to son. 1,000 years of trial and error encoded in mud brick. If you asked a builder why the dome was shaped that way, he might shrug and say, because that's how it works. No equations. Just tradition refined into science without anyone using the word. Of course, not every yakchal was perfect. Some cracked. Some leaked. Some melted their stores by midsummer, leaving villagers frustrated. But enough worked that the system endured for centuries. Entire towns built and maintained them. They became landmarks, giant, looming cones that everyone recognized, part of the landscape as much as minarets or caravanserais. And in their quiet way, they remind us how much ancient engineering was about patience. Nothing flashy, just mud, wind, and careful design, creating spaces that could defy the seasons. The same principles, insulation, airflow, radiant cooling, still sit at the heart of modern architecture. Only now we hide them behind concrete and steel instead of letting the dome announce itself against the sky. So tonight, picture yourself stepping into one. The door is low, half hidden in the slope of the dome. Inside, the air shifts cool against your skin. Your footsteps echo faintly. Somewhere above, a badger hums with moving air. The walls smell of earth and straw. And beneath your feet, ice waits in silence, sealed under layers of straw, held in place by plaster, preserved by geometry. No humming generators, no buzzing refrigerators. Just physics in mud brick, working quietly while the desert blazes outside. So, the yakchal is full. The ice is layered, the dome sealed, the vents adjusted. Now comes the long wait. Winter passes into spring, barley fields green up, lambs bleat in the pastures. The yakchal sits in silence, slowly swallowing the melting drip of its treasure. By the time summer heat arrives, it's ready. The doors creak open, baskets are lowered, and winter begins to trickle out, chip by chip, into the hands of people who can afford it. The most famous use was, of course, sherbet. Not the frozen dessert we know today, but a sweetened drink, fruit syrups, rosewater, lemon juice, pomegranate, honey, poured over chipped ice. Imagine a blazing afternoon in Isfahan, dust hanging in the air, the streets shimmering. A noble reclines in a shaded courtyard, a servant handing him a glass beaded with condensation. He sips rose-flavored sherbet chilled with ice hauled from the yakchal. Around him, poets recite verses, musicians strum lutes, and the sherbet steals the show. Persian poets loved to wax lyrical about it. Chilled drinks became metaphors for refreshment of the soul, for fleeting pleasures, for the sharp sweetness of life in a hot, dry land. Cold as snow, sweet as love, one line goes. When poets write about drinks, you know it mattered. Ice also appeared at weddings and feasts. A bride might be honored with chilled sherbet. Guests offered cups of icy water flavored with mint or lime. In a society where most people drank water lukewarm or hot from the kettle, ice was dazzling. Serving it was like serving gold, a sign of generosity, wealth, and power. And yes, ice had a place in medicine. Persian physicians, influenced by Greek and Islamic medical theory, believed cold could balance the body's humors. Feverish patients were given sips of chilled water. Ice packs were placed on swollen joints or aching heads. A doctor might recommend shaved ice mixed with fruit syrup to cool the blood. Did it help? Sometimes. Maybe. At the very least, it was comforting. And in a world where much medicine was frankly wishful thinking, that was something. But ice wasn't just medicine or refreshment. It was a status symbol. Ordinary villagers might glimpse it once or twice a year, at a festival, or if a kind neighbor shared. Nobles and kings, though, could order it daily. A ruler presenting sherbet to his court wasn't just showing hospitality. He was showing control. He commanded not just armies and taxes, but the seasons themselves. He had winter at his beck and call in the heart of summer. Still, there were moments when ice touched ordinary life. Festivals often included cool drinks for the crowd. Weddings in wealthier villages might see ice distributed in small chipped cups. Children would beg for slivers, darting around with sticky fingers. A sick elder might receive a carefully rationed cup of chilled water as medicine. The Yakchul was never fully democratic, but it wasn't fully closed off either. It stood at the edge of the village like a promise that even in the furnace of July, there was a taste of relief waiting. And of course, there was the psychology of it. Think about how different ice must have felt then. Today, you open a freezer and don't think twice. But in Persia, when a servant brought a chipped block into a courtyard, all eyes followed it. The cool mist rising as it melted, the frosty surface catching the light, it was theater. The act of serving ice was as impressive as the ice itself. The social rituals mattered too. To refuse sherbet offered by a host was rude, even unthinkable. To serve it stingily made you look miserly. The politics of ice were real. A generous host with baskets of chipped ice won admiration. A stingy one with warm water looked cheap. Hospitality in Persia was sacred, and ice became part of that sacred duty. So tonight, picture the scene. A noble's courtyard at dusk. Lanterns swing from carved niches. The air is still hot, but the first stars are out. Servants bring trays of tall cups filled with crushed ice, syrups poured in shimmering reds and golds. Guests murmur, sip slowly, savor the cold. Musicians play, poets recite, and someone makes a wry comment about the expense of hauling snow down mountains. Laughter ripples, the ice clinks in cups, and the night stretches on, cooled by blocks of winter hidden in a mud brick dome. Meanwhile, in the village beyond, a bride receives her own chipped cup at her wedding. Children lick stolen shards behind a wall. A feverish boy sips water cooled with a precious sliver. Different scales, different lives, but all made possible by the same silent Yakchul. The dome didn't just preserve ice. It preserved comfort, hospitality, and prestige. It turned back-breaking winter labor into summer joy. And in its cool silence, it held a little piece of magic, the power to stop the season, to hold time still, if only for a while. The genius of the Yakchul wasn't just that it worked, it's that it kept working for centuries. Long after dynasties fell, long after palaces turned to ruins, villagers still trudged out in winter to freeze pools of water and haul ice into domes. Empires came and went, but the mud brick refrigerators stayed. By the Islamic Golden Age, Yakchuls were woven into Persian life. Medieval geographers mention them casually, as if of course everyone knew about the ice pits. Poets likened their domes to resting mountains, silent guardians of villages. Travelers marveled at sipping cold drinks in the middle of deserts. And rulers still flaunted ice as a luxury, building ever grander courtyards where sherbet flowed. The structures themselves aged slowly, but well. Mud brick needs upkeep, of course. Every few decades, villagers patched cracks, renewed the sarouge plaster, replaced worn windcatchers. A neglected Yakchul could crumble, but a tended one could last centuries. Some still stand today, silent cones against the horizon, long after the villages they served have shifted or vanished. European travelers to Persia in the 17th and 18th centuries often wrote about their surprise at finding ice in the desert. They described vast domes storing snow hauled from distant mountains. Some were skeptical, assuming the locals exaggerated. Then they tasted sherbet in July and admitted that, yes, the Persians had mastered something unusual. One French visitor wrote admiringly about the plaster linings that kept the pits waterproof, noting they were more durable than anything he'd seen in Europe. Which is a polite way of saying, our basements leak and theirs don't. But even as the outside world changed, the rhythm of the Yakchul stayed constant. Winter labor, spring sealing, summer rewards. Villagers grew up with it, passed knowledge to their children, and rarely questioned it. In some towns, families took turns maintaining the ice pits, each responsible for a section. The Yakchul was as much part of the communal landscape as wells, mosques, or markets. Of course, modernization eventually crept in. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, imported ice and new technologies began to appear in Iran's cities. Mechanical ice plants popped up, first in ports, then in capitals. Suddenly, you didn't need to wait until summer for carefully rationed blocks from a mud brick dome. You could just buy ice from a machine. The glamour of sherbet didn't fade, but the infrastructure behind it changed. Many yachtals fell into disuse. Some crumbled back into the desert. Others were repurposed, as storage pits for grain, as workshops, even as barns. But a surprising number endured, half buried, their domes still visible against the sand. Archaeologists in the 20th century began cataloguing them, realizing these weren't just quaint village structures but a sophisticated system of environmental engineering. Today, several yachtals still stand in Iran, especially around Yazd. Tourists wander through their cool interiors, marveling at the silence and the lingering chill. Guides explain the Sarouj plaster, the wind catchers, the clever geometry. Locals sometimes smile. Their grandparents once hauled ice there, after all. For them, the yachtl isn't just ancient architecture, it's family history. In recent years, there's been a quiet revival of interest. Architects study yachtls for sustainable design lessons. Environmental engineers point out that they kept ice without burning fuel or consuming electricity, something worth remembering in a warming world. Mud brick, wind, and patience may not be glamorous, but they left behind a model of low-tech sustainability that still makes sense. And yet, standing in front of one today, you wouldn't necessarily think of climate science. You'd probably just feel the same or those old travelers felt. How did people in a scorching desert keep ice? The answer is right there, baked into the domes, whispering through the wind catchers. A community's winter labor stored and guarded by mud brick geometry, still holding traces of frost centuries later. So tonight, picture a ruined yachtl at dusk. Its dome is cracked, its plaster weathered, but its silhouette still commands the horizon. Children play nearby, their laughter echoing against the old walls. Tourists snap photos, their guides explaining how it once held tons of ice. The dome doesn't answer. It just stands, as it has for centuries, a reminder that sometimes the quietest technologies endure the longest. Civilizations rise, technologies race ahead, but the old domes of Persia still dot the desert, patient and silent, long after the last block of ice has melted. The yachtl was never just architecture. It was memory. A dome holding not only ice, but the labor, prestige, and poetry of centuries. And as with most things that endure, its meaning shifted with time. For the laborer, it was sweat and frost-bitten fingers. Nights spent hauling snow, mornings spent chiseling ice. A winter of work that no one toasted in summer, though everyone tasted. For the merchant, it was profit, baskets of ice sold in courtyards, contracts signed under the shade of minarets. For the physician, it was medicine, a chance to soothe fevers, cool wounds, balance humors. And for the poet, it was metaphor. Persian poetry loved the language of cold. Ice and snow became symbols of purity, detachment, fleeting beauty. A beloved's indifference compared to the coldness of snow. The shock of sherbet on a hot day likened to the sweetness of love. Even paradise was imagined as a garden where shade and cool water never faded. Every chipped block of ice pulled from a dome carried layers of meaning as much as it carried chill. For rulers, ice was politics. To serve sherbet at court was to display mastery over nature. Guests sipping chilled drinks knew what it meant. This was a king who commanded mountains, who bent seasons to his will, who could bring winter into summer. Mud brick and straw became a subtle tool of power. And yet, ice remained rooted in community. Weddings, festivals, the quiet gift of a chipped block to a sick child, these moments softened the edge of hierarchy. Even if nobles feasted on sherbet, villagers still knew the dome held a little bit of winter for them too. The endurance of yachtls is almost absurd. Palaces fell. Roads crumbled. Dynasties dissolved. But mud brick domes stood quietly in the sand. Because unlike empires, they didn't need glory. They needed only clay, wind, and patience. Civilization is fragile, but a good filing system, or a good refrigerator, tends to last. Today, when you step into one, you feel it immediately. The hush. The faint coolness, even on a hot day. The smell of earth, plaster, and dust. The way sound muffles inside the thick walls. You imagine the pit filled with ice, layered with straw, the villagers' breath steaming in winter as they dropped basket after basket into the depths. And for a moment, time folds. You're just another visitor in a line stretching back 1,000 years, staring up at a mud brick dome that still remembers winter. And maybe that's the most human thing about them. Not the geometry, not the plaster formulas, not even the poetry. It's the desire to hold on to something fleeting, to capture cold, bottle it, guard it, and release it slowly when it's most needed. We can dress it up as engineering, or call it luxury, or frame it as sustainability. But at its core, it's simple, people trying to keep a little bit of relief in a harsh world. Meanwhile, in another corner of history, we're stepping into Constantinople, the city of domes, mosaics, and a bureaucracy so thick it could strangle an elephant. And in the middle of all that gold and marble, the story isn't about battles or crusades, but something far softer: silk. Long threads of shimmering, secret silk that Byzantium guarded as tightly as its crown jewels. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and picture yourself drifting into a city where the clatter of looms was as important as the chants in church. Silk is one of those materials that feels too fancy to be real. Smooth, glossy, ridiculously soft. It catches the light in ways no other fabric can. For centuries, the only way to get it was to buy it from China, where silkworms munched mulberry leaves and did their magic. To the Romans, silk was exotic, scandalous, and a little bit suspicious. Senators grumbled about men wearing silk robes, calling it unmanly. Women draped themselves in translucent silks that made conservative moralists absolutely lose their minds. And all of it came from far away, through caravans and traders, each step inflating the price until a bolt of silk was worth more than gold. The Byzantine Empire inherited this silk obsession. But instead of just buying it, the emperors wanted control. And by the 6th century, they got their wish, through a bit of state-sponsored smuggling. The story goes like this. Under Emperor Justinian, around the year 550, 2 monks traveled east. They made it all the way to China, saw how silk was made, and realized the big secret: silkworms. The worms spun the magical thread, not some mystical plant or exotic mineral as people had guessed. The monks smuggled silkworm eggs back to Constantinople, hidden inside hollow bamboo canes, because apparently TSA wasn't around to check for contraband caterpillars. Just like that, the Byzantine Empire had its own silk industry. And naturally, the emperors immediately seized control. No free market here. Silk production became an imperial monopoly, run through tightly controlled workshops. If you wanted silk, you bought it from the emperor. If you wanted to weave silk, you worked in his factories. And if you wanted to wear certain silks, especially imperial purple, well, good luck unless you happen to be the emperor yourself. And here's where the looms come in. Behind palace walls, in workshops scattered through Constantinople, looms clattered day and night. We don't know exactly how many, but enough to churn out bolts of shimmering cloth for court, church, and export. Workers spun thread from silkworm cocoons, dyed it in rich colors, and wove it into intricate patterns: eagles, crosses, vines, saints. The result was cloth so dazzling that ambassadors wrote home about it, and kings begged to receive it as gifts. Life in the workshops was not glamorous. Imagine long rows of looms, the air thick with dust and dye fumes. Men and women bent over threads, hands aching, eyes straining. Supervisors kept strict watch, because every scrap of silk belonged to the emperor. Theft was unthinkable, though probably still attempted. Somewhere, you can imagine a weaver slipping a thread into a sleeve, hoping no one notices. The workers themselves were not free entrepreneurs. They were employees of the state, part of a massive imperial machine. Bureaucrats recorded output, tracked bolts, logged deliveries. Some workshops specialized in weaving, others in dyeing. The most important colors, like Tyrian purple, that deep, royal shade wrung from sea snails, were reserved for imperial orders. Try wearing purple without permission, and you might end up with more than just a fashion citation. And it wasn't only about fashion. Silk was diplomacy. When the emperor wanted to impress a foreign ruler, he sent bolts of Byzantine silk. When he wanted to bind allies, he draped them in imperial robes. Silk was a currency of prestige, as important as gold or land. To control silk was to control status. So tonight, imagine Constantinople at dawn. The city wakes slowly. Bells ring from Hagia Sophia, markets stir, the smell of bread drifts from ovens. And in a quiet quarter, the clatter of looms begins. Threads stretch taut, shuttles clack back and forth, voices murmur over dye pots. Supervisors pace, scribes tally, and somewhere in the palace, an official writes down, 3 bolts crimson, for bolts gold, delivered to the emperor's treasury. No one outside the walls sees the workers. They just see the robes later, draped on emperors, bishops, generals. To the crowd, it looks like magic. But behind the silk was endless labor, secrecy, and a system so strict it could only belong to Byzantium. The threads weren't just fabric. They were power, wound tight on imperial looms. So, what did daily life look like in these workshops? Forget the gleaming mosaics of Hagia Sophia. Picture instead long, narrow rooms crammed with looms. Shuttles clack back and forth. Spindles hum as they twist fine filaments into thread. Dye vats bubble in the corners, clouds of color rising with the steam. And all of it smells, not of roses or frankincense, but of wet cocoons, boiled dye plants, and, occasionally, sea snails. Luxury fabrics always sound better when you don't think too hard about where the color comes from. The dyes alone were a world of work. Red came from madder root, soaked and boiled into vivid pigment. Green from copper salts or blended layers of blue and yellow. Gold thread was made by hammering real gold leaf into strips and wrapping it around a silk core, delicate, tedious, and expensive. And then there was Tyrian purple, the color of emperors. Made from murex sea snails, harvested in smelly heaps, boiled down until only a few drops of dye remained. It took thousands of snails for a single cloak. No wonder only emperors could wear it. Honestly, it's the kind of smell that would make you happy to ban everyone else from using it. The patterns woven were complex. Griffins, lions, eagles with 2 heads, saints framed in circles, endless vines, and crosses. Some were purely decorative, others symbolic, designed to proclaim power, faith, or dynastic legitimacy. To wear silk wasn't just to wear pretty fabric. It was to wear a message. A robe might shout, "I am loyal to Christ," or "I serve the emperor," or more bluntly, "I am richer than you." Workers weren't just random craftspeople. They belonged to guilds, each specializing in a stage of production. Spinning, weaving, dyeing. Guild rules dictated everything from wages to working hours to who could touch which stage of the process. The state kept a close eye on these guilds, issuing decrees about how much silk could be produced and who could buy it. One Byzantine emperor, Leo VI, also known as Leo the Wise, and occasionally Leo the Overly Specific, issued laws setting exact penalties for anyone caught selling silk illegally. The state wasn't messing around. And here's the thing, these rules weren't just for fun. They were about control. Silk was too valuable to be left to private hands. Every bolt represented money, power, and prestige. By monopolizing silk, the emperor could starve rivals of resources, flood allies with gifts, and remind everyone that even fabric bowed to imperial authority. Of course, this meant bureaucracy. Mountains of it. Registers of who wove what. Lists of bolts produced and distributed. Records of which bishop got which ceremonial robe. Somewhere, deep in the palace archives, some poor scribe spent his life writing, 2 bolts crimson, 1 bolt gold, dispatched to the patriarch. The Byzantines were experts at turning even beauty into paperwork. Life in the workshops was hard. Hours were long, and mistakes costly. Drop a thread of gold, and you risked punishment. Spill dye, and you might ruin a whole bolt. Supervisors paced constantly, eyes sharp for theft. Did some weavers sneak silk home anyway? Almost certainly. People have been stealing office supplies since offices existed. But the penalties were severe, and with informants everywhere, you had to be bold or very desperate. Despite the monotony, there was pride too. To be a silk weaver in Constantinople was to touch something few others could. Your cloth would drape emperors, bishops, generals. Your patterns would shine in cathedrals and palaces. Even if your name never appeared on a ledger, your work traveled the empire. The prestige of silk rubbed off, just a little, on the hands that made it. So tonight, imagine standing in one of those workshops. The light filters in through small windows, dust swirling in the beams. Looms creak, shuttles snap, threads stretch taut across wooden frames. The air smells of dye and damp plaster. Workers murmur to each other, shoulders bent, fingers quick. Supervisors walk slowly between rows, eyes sharp, styluses ready to tally production. Outside, in the city, no one sees this. They see only the finished robe, gleaming, patterned, divine. They bow to it in ceremonies, marvel at its beauty, and never think of the clattering looms hidden behind palace walls. But inside, the looms sing on, weaving not just cloth, but power itself. So, let's talk purple. Not just any purple, but that purple, deep, rich, almost black in some lights. Tyrian purple, squeezed out of unfortunate sea snails. Expensive, smelly to produce, and the ultimate symbol of power. In Byzantium, purple wasn't just a color. It was a political statement. By the early Byzantine period, the empire had locked down silk production. Workshops ran under state control, dyeing and weaving only what the emperor allowed. And purple? That was his color. Literally. Byzantine law made it illegal for anyone outside the imperial family to wear certain shades of purple silk. Forget fashion police. This was fashion backed by actual police. Show up to court in an unauthorized purple tunic, and you weren't just tacky. You were a criminal. Purple was so tied to the emperor that even his children carried the color in their titles. Born in the special porphyry chamber of the imperial palace, they were called porphyrogenitus, born in the purple. A reminder that they weren't just royal by blood, but royal by the very color of their birth chamber. It's like being stamped with the Pantone code for power. And it wasn't just clothing. Imperial ceremonies dripped with silk and purple. The emperor's throne room shimmered with hangings, curtains, and canopies woven in dazzling patterns. His robes gleamed with embroidered eagles and crosses. Even his boots had purple touches. The Patriarch of Constantinople, head of the church, wore silks too, but carefully regulated ones, lest anyone confuse church for crown. The monopoly gave emperors a weapon. Want to honor an ally? Send him a bolt of Byzantine silk. Want to insult a rival? Refuse to send any. Silk became the diplomatic equivalent of a love letter or a slap in the face. Arab caliphs, Frankish kings, even popes longed for Byzantine silks. Some begged for them. Others sulked when they didn't get them. The emperor could give or withhold cloth the way modern powers give or withhold trade agreements. Only much prettier. The laws around silk could get oddly specific. Certain offices were entitled to certain garments. Generals might wear patterned silk, but never imperial purple. Court officials had robes in regulated colors, each signaling their rank. Imagine a bureaucracy where not just your salary, but your wardrobe was set by decree. Show up in the wrong color, and it wasn't just a faux pas, it was a violation of the pecking order. And these laws weren't suggestions. Emperors issued edicts forbidding private silk trade, shutting down smugglers, and punishing anyone who tried to slip forbidden cloth onto the market. Did people break the rules? Of course they did. There are hints of black markets, of silks being smuggled out of workshops, of foreign merchants bribing their way to a bolt of the forbidden stuff. But officially, all threads led to the emperor. Purple was even a kind of propaganda. Coins, mosaics, manuscripts, all showed emperors in shimmering silk robes, often with purple borders. The image was unmistakable. This man alone had the right to wear this cloth. Even if you never saw the emperor in person, you saw him in silk, blazing from every icon. And the symbolism didn't stop at death. Imperial burial shrouds were silk too, richly dyed, wrapped around the body of emperors and empresses. To die in purple was as much a claim to eternity as to life. Even in tombs, the monopoly followed. The irony, of course, is that while emperors guarded silk like treasure, ordinary people saw only scraps of it. A sleeve here, a church hanging there, a glimpse of robes at a festival. To them, silk wasn't fabric. It was spectacle. It shimmered at a distance, always just out of reach, always a reminder of who had power and who didn't. So tonight, imagine a court ceremony in Constantinople. The emperor enters, cloaked in purple silk, its sheen glowing under lamplight. Courtiers bow low, their own robes carefully colored according to law. Behind him, Walls hung with embroidered silks ripple faintly in the draft. Scribes stand ready to record every detail. Foreign ambassadors gape, dazzled. Somewhere in the background, a clerk silently notes, 2 bolts of purple expended for today's ceremony. It looks like majesty. It sounds like awe. But behind the shimmer is a bureaucracy of looms, laws, and supervisors making sure no one, anywhere, wears a single forbidden thread without permission. Purple was never just a color. In Byzantium, it was the empire itself, spun, dyed, and woven into every inch of authority. If court life was drenched in silk, the church was practically baptized in it. Byzantium didn't just weave fabric for emperors, it wove fabric for God. Or at least, for the officials who claimed to speak in his name. Step into Hagia Sophia on a feast day. The vast dome glitters with gold mosaics. Candles flicker, incense clouds rise, and choirs chant until the air itself hums. And everywhere you look, silk. Silk banners ripple in the rafters. Silk curtains frame the sanctuary. Silk vestments shimmer on priests, embroidered with crosses, angels, and saints. The altar is veiled in silk hangings. Even relics are wrapped in silk cloth, carefully layered like divine gifts hidden in shimmering packages. Silk here wasn't about comfort. It was about awe. It caught light in a way wool and linen never could, reflecting candle flames like tiny stars. To step into a Byzantine church was to be surrounded by fabric that whispered, "This is heaven on earth." And yes, it was also to be surrounded by the emperor's monopoly, because even God's house ran on state-controlled looms. Priestly vestments were carefully codified. Bishops wore silk stoles and cloaks with embroidered crosses. Deacons had long flowing dalmatics, patterned in gold thread. Some garments were simple, others ornate, but the hierarchy was stitched into the fabric itself. Just as courtiers wore colors by rank, so too did the clergy. Even in prayer, silk carried rules. And let's not forget the icons. Portable icons of Christ and the Virgin were often dressed in little silk robes, layered like dolls. Pilgrims carried silk ribbons or fragments as tokens. Relics were wrapped in silk, stored in silk-lined boxes, touched with silk cloths to absorb their holiness. It sounds like overkill until you realize, in Byzantium, silk wasn't just fabric. It was a medium of sanctity. The empire also exported this holy shimmer. Gifts of silk were sent to churches abroad, to Rome, to monasteries, to bishops seeking imperial favor. The cloth wasn't just diplomacy between rulers. It was diplomacy between faiths. When the Pope in Rome received a bolt of Byzantine silk, it wasn't just cloth. It was a reminder. Constantinople still saw itself as the true heart of Christendom, weaving holiness into every thread. And if you think relics wrapped in silk were just symbolic, think again. Many survive. Open the reliquaries of Europe's cathedrals and you'll often find fragments of Byzantine silk still clinging to bones or shriveled saints' hands. Bright patterns of eagles or vines, preserved for 1,000 years, mute witnesses to the empire that wrapped the dead as carefully as the living. Silk also played a role in processions, those grand parades through Constantinople where emperor and church blurred together. Streets were lined with banners of silk. Priests carried icons draped in silk coverings. The emperor himself rode beneath silk canopies, shaded by cloth shimmering in the sun. The whole city became a stage, with silk as the backdrop. Ordinary people might never touch it, but they saw it, paraded before their eyes, woven into memory. And here's the irony, while silk was tied to holiness, it was also tied to suspicion. Some church fathers grumbled about its luxury. They worried silk distracted from humility. A robe too glittery might tempt vanity instead of piety. But the complaints never stuck. The shimmer was too effective. In a world where ceremony was theology made visible, silk won every argument. So tonight, picture a vigil in Hagia Sophia. The lights are low, the dome fading into shadow. The congregation murmurs prayers. Priests in embroidered silk move slowly, swinging censers. A reliquary gleams on the altar, its contents wrapped in patterned cloth. Candles reflect off banners above, turning fabric into waves of gold and red. You stand in the crowd, watching, and for a moment, it feels like heaven has descended, not on clouds, but on looms. In Byzantium, silk wasn't just worn. It was worshipped, wrapped, paraded, and sanctified. Threads of mulberry-fed worms turned into threads of divine theatre, binding court to church, earth to heaven, politics to prayer. The loom clattered, and the empire prayed in silk. The Byzantines never really had to brag about their silk. The rest of the world did it for them. From Baghdad to Aachen, people whispered about the dazzling fabrics woven in the emperor's workshops, shimmering with gold, patterned with eagles, glowing with impossible shades of red and purple. And for centuries, if you wanted the good stuff, you had to go through Constantinople. Silk was the empire's most dazzling export. Caravans carried bolts westward into Europe, where kings and bishops scrambled to get their hands on them. Traders brought them south into the Islamic world, where caliphs both admired and envied the Byzantine monopoly. Even in China, where silk had first been born, there was awareness that Byzantium had carved out its own imperial style. But the Byzantines weren't just selling fabric. They were selling prestige. Emperors used silk as a weapon of diplomacy. When envoys from a foreign king arrived in Constantinople, they weren't just fed and housed. They were dazzled. Ceremonies in the Great Palace showed them halls dripping with silk hangings, courtiers robed in shimmering cloth, and the emperor seated under a canopy woven with gold thread. It was like saying, "Welcome to our empire. Please notice that even our curtains are richer than your crown." And then, of course, the gifts came. A few bolts of silk, carefully selected, sent home with the envoys. Enough to impress, but not enough to satisfy. The message was clear: Byzantium could provide beauty, but only on its terms. You wanted more? You'd need to behave like a good ally. Europe was especially enthralled. Frankish kings collected Byzantine silks the way modern collectors hoard rare art. Charlemagne himself, crowned emperor in 800, made a point of acquiring Byzantine fabrics for his church treasuries. When he decorated Aachen Cathedral, guess what he used to wrap relics and adorn altars? Byzantine silk. The message was subtle but obvious. By draping his church in silk, Charlemagne was borrowing a little bit of Constantinople's glamour. The papacy, too, craved it. Popes in Rome received silks as gifts, often from emperors trying to keep papal loyalties from drifting elsewhere. Relics of saints were wrapped in Byzantine cloth, the shimmer of the fabric lending holiness to the bones inside. Even today, many European churches preserve scraps of silk in their treasuries, sometimes brighter than the relics themselves. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, admiration mingled with competition. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad imported Byzantine silks for their palaces, even as they built up their own weaving centers in response. Muslim artisans in places like Damascus and Cairo developed brilliant textile traditions of their own, rivaling Byzantine patterns with geometric designs and calligraphy. But the Byzantines always claimed a certain edge. Theirs was the imperial silk, the one draped on emperors and bishops, not just sultans and caliphs. Sometimes, envy boiled into outright tension. Treaties between Byzantium and its neighbors often included clauses about silk trade. Who could buy it, how much, at what price? More than once, emperors threatened to cut off silk supplies entirely if a neighbor misbehaved. Imagine your country being so addicted to fabric that it becomes a bargaining chip in diplomacy. That was medieval realpolitik, one shimmering bolt at a time. Smuggling was inevitable. Merchants tried to sneak Byzantine silks out of the empire, selling them at inflated prices abroad. Officials cracked down, confiscating contraband, issuing edicts, fining smugglers. But there's no doubt some bolts slipped through. Foreign elites wore them proudly, sometimes without knowing they'd been technically stolen. Nothing quite says luxury like illegally imported from Constantinople. And what did the Byzantines think of all this? They knew exactly what they had. They weren't just selling fabric. They were selling identity. Every bolt of silk that left the empire carried with it a piece of Byzantine prestige. When a Frankish king draped his altar in silk, he was, in some quiet way, admitting Constantinople still set the standard. So tonight, imagine an embassy in the 10th century. Envoys from the Fatimid Caliphate arrive in Constantinople. They're ushered into a hall lined with silks, their eyes widening as they take in gold-threaded curtains and purple robes. The emperor sits under a canopy woven with imperial eagles, barely moving, radiating power. At the end of the ceremony, gifts are bestowed, bolts of silk, rolled neatly, carried out with ceremony. The envoys bow, clutch their prizes, and later, back home, unfurl them with awe. The cloth shines. The prestige glows. And Byzantium sits smugly on its throne, knowing it has once again spun threads that reach far beyond its borders. Silk, by its nature, shouldn't last. It's fragile. It fades, it frays, it dissolves in damp earth. And yet, somehow, Byzantine silk has managed to outlive the empire itself. The domes of Constantinople have fallen, the emperors are dust, but scraps of cloth, shimmering eagles, faded vines, tangled saints in gold thread, still survive. Many of these survivors ended up far from their looms. In cathedrals across Europe, relics are still wrapped in Byzantine silks, sometimes so intact you can see the pattern of the weave. Eagles spread their wings across reliquaries in France. Gold-threaded vines twine across altar cloths in Germany. In Italy, entire robes of Byzantine silk were preserved in church treasuries, cherished not just as fabric but as holy objects in their own right. Ironically, silk meant to advertise imperial authority now survives mainly in places the empire lost influence to. The very cloth meant to proclaim Byzantine supremacy now whispers from museums in Paris, London, and Vienna. Visitors peer at fragments behind glass, marveling at their survival. The empire may be gone, but its threads are still tugging at our attention. And what about ordinary Byzantines? Most of them never touched silk. They wore wool, linen, maybe cotton if they could afford it. They saw silk from a distance, on bishops in church, on emperors in parades, hanging in palaces they could never enter. To them, silk was a shimmering symbol of a world far above their own. A fisherman might glimpse a bolt carried past in a procession and shake his head. A farmer might mutter about taxes while watching bishops glitter at a festival. Silk was beautiful, but it was also a reminder, some things were not for you. That gulf between the silk-clad elite and the wool-clad masses may be one reason why Byzantium sometimes felt like two empires, one of gold and purple, one of dust and toil. The looms clattered for emperors, but the people kept wearing plain cloth. Even so, silk stitched itself into memory. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, they inherited not just walls and palaces but also the looms. The art of weaving never stopped. Ottoman silks carried forward patterns and techniques first refined in Byzantine workshops. The monopoly was gone, the empire collapsed, but the craft lingered on in new forms. And today, when we speak of Byzantium, we still picture it shimmering, mosaics glowing, robes gleaming, churches draped in cloth that caught the light like no other. That shimmer is silk, caught forever in the imagination, even if the looms have long since fallen silent. So tonight, picture the end. Constantinople in its twilight years. The empire shrunken, the treasury thin, the court ceremonies a little threadbare. But still, the emperor appears in purple silk, the choirs sing beneath silk hangings, and foreign envoys still bow before shimmering cloth. Even as the empire crumbled, the illusion of power, woven in silk, held on. And then picture now. A quiet museum gallery. Behind the glass, a fragment of cloth, faded, frayed, barely holding its pattern. An eagle's wing, a vine curling, a saint's face picked out in gold. It has traveled through centuries, survived fire, war, decay, and neglect. It rests silently, a scrap of an empire that lived and died by thread. The emperors are gone. The palaces are ruins. But the silk still waits. Threads spun by worms, woven by hands, guarded by emperors, cherished by priests, smuggled by merchants, admired by kings, all still here, whispering in the quiet. Byzantium was many things, a fortress, a bureaucracy, a dream of Rome. But most of all, it was a shimmer that survives in silk.